Chapter 1. The Eternal City. The story of Rome begins long before marble temples, armored legions, and emperors draped in purple. It begins as a small settlement along the banks of the Tiber River, in the central part of the Italian peninsula. The landscape was a blend of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and coastal access to the Mediterranean. Geography mattered. Rome was close enough to trade routes to grow wealthy, but far enough inland to be somewhat protected from seaborne invaders. Legend, of course, tells us that Rome was founded in 753 BCE by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, who were said to have been raised by a she-wolf after being abandoned as infants. Their myth carried themes of struggle, survival, and destiny. Eventually, Romulus killed Remus in a quarrel and gave his own name to the city. This tale, whether true or not, reflects values Romans cherished: resilience, ferocity, and an acceptance of violence as part of fate. Outside of myth, archaeology suggests that Rome emerged from a cluster of pastoral villages on the Palatine Hill. Huts of wood and thatch dotted the landscape. People herded livestock, practiced small-scale farming, and traded with neighboring communities. Over time, these villages merged, and the settlement began to organize itself more like a town. The Tiber River gave them a convenient crossing point and a path for trade. Early Rome was heavily influenced by its neighbors. To the north were the Etruscans, a sophisticated people with a rich culture. They introduced Romans to engineering techniques, the use of the arch in construction, and even certain religious rituals. From the south came the Greeks, who had colonies along the Italian coast. Rome borrowed from their art, their gods, and their alphabet. The Romans were never ashamed to adapt the best of what others created. This practicality became one of their defining strengths. The monarchy was the first form of Roman government. According to tradition, 7 kings ruled in succession, beginning with Romulus and ending with Tarquin the Proud. The kings oversaw not only religious rituals and public works, but also the establishment of political and social structures. Under these early rulers, Rome grew from a loose settlement into a city with fortifications, drainage systems, and organized military forces. But kingship was not to last. The last monarch, Tarquin the Proud, was remembered as cruel and despotic. His abuses of power, along with a scandal involving his family, triggered an uprising around 509 BCE. The Romans overthrew him and vowed never again to be ruled by a king. This act set into motion the establishment of the Republic, which would define Rome for centuries. Still, even before the Republic's official birth, the seeds of Rome's future greatness were visible. Its location gave it both access and protection. Its culture, drawn from myth and borrowed from neighbors, gave it flexibility. Its people valued strength, endurance, and a fierce independence. Rome was not yet an empire, or even a dominant city in Italy. It was simply one community among many. But its foundations were in place. From a handful of huts by the Tiber River, a story was beginning, one that would stretch across continents, shape the Western world, and echo through history as the tale of the Eternal City. Chapter 2. The Republic. With the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud around 509 BCE, Rome entered a new stage in its political life. The monarchy was gone, and in its place the Romans built a republic, a system they believed would protect them from tyranny while still allowing for effective governance. The word res publica meant the public thing, and it emphasized that power and responsibility now belonged to the community rather than a single ruler. The Republic was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it contained remarkable innovations. Executive authority was vested in 2 consuls, elected annually. These consuls shared power equally, and each had the ability to veto the other's decisions. The short one-year term and the dual leadership ensured that no individual could seize too much control. Alongside them, the Senate acted as the central advisory body. Though not elected by the people, senators, drawn largely from Rome's leading families, became the stewards of Roman tradition, law, and foreign policy. The early republic was marked by tension between two social classes: the patricians, who were the aristocratic elite, and the plebeians, who represented the common citizens. Patricians monopolized political and religious offices, and for a time the republic operated as a government by and for this upper class. But plebeians were far from passive. They organized, protested, and even seceded from the city at times to demand reforms. Out of this long struggle, known as the conflict of the orders, came gradual concessions that gave plebeians more rights and political representation. One important step was the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs. Tribunes had the power to protect plebeian interests, and most significantly, they could veto actions by magistrates that threatened the common people. This provided a critical check within the Roman system. Another milestone was the codification of the 12 Tables around 450 BCE, which set laws in writing and made them visible to all citizens. This reduced the ability of elites to manipulate unwritten customs for their own advantage. While Rome was refining its political institutions, it was also expanding militarily. The Republic relied on the citizen-soldier model. Every free male citizen was expected to serve in the legions when called. Service was both a duty and a path to honor. Through a combination of discipline, organization, and relentless perseverance, Roman armies began to conquer neighboring communities in Latium. Victories brought new land, resources, and opportunities, but also required new strategies for governance. Rome's approach to conquered peoples was unusually flexible. Some were granted partial citizenship, others full citizenship over time. Many communities retained a measure of local autonomy while contributing soldiers to Roman campaigns. This system created loyalty and integration rather than endless rebellion. Rome did not simply crush its neighbors, it absorbed them. This willingness to share the benefits of Roman identity proved to be one of the Republic's greatest strengths. As the Republic spread across Italy, it built infrastructure to hold its territory together. Roads connected distant towns to Rome, making the movement of troops and trade far more efficient. Aqueducts carried water into cities, and standardized coinage facilitated commerce. The Forum, already the political and social heart of Rome, became a symbol of the Republic's vitality, filled with speeches, trials, and bustling markets. Yet the Republic was always a balancing act. The annual election cycle meant constant turnover, and ambitious men sought glory through military campaigns and public works. Wealth and land concentrated in the hands of elites, while poorer citizens sometimes struggled. The political reforms achieved by plebeians were real, but tensions never disappeared. Still, for centuries, the system endured, imperfect, contested, and evolving, but resilient enough to handle crisis after crisis. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome was no longer just a local Italian power. It was poised to confront Carthage in the Punic Wars, a conflict that would test the Republic's endurance and push it toward dominance in the Mediterranean world. The Republic had matured into a formidable engine of conquest and governance. What began as a rejection of kingship had transformed into a system that produced stability, military might, and an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. The Roman Republic was not destined to last forever, but in its centuries of life it forged ideas of citizenship, representation, and law that would echo long after its fall. For now it stood as a unique experiment. Neither monarchy nor democracy, but something in between. A republic that carried the ambitions of its people across Italy and soon beyond. Chapter 3. The empire ascends. The Roman Republic had endured for nearly 5 centuries, but its own success became a burden. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, victories brought wealth, slaves, and land, but also corruption, inequality, and political rivalry. By the 1st century BCE, the Republic was straining under the weight of empire. Civil wars, ambitious generals, and a restless population set the stage for transformation. Out of this turbulence, the Roman Empire emerged. The turning point arrived with the career of Julius Caesar. A skilled general and shrewd politician, Caesar had risen through the ranks by cultivating alliances and achieving spectacular victories. His conquest of Gaul, a region encompassing modern France and Belgium, showcased the power of Roman military discipline and Caesar's own charisma. His commentaries, written in a direct and persuasive style, spread news of his victories back to Rome and elevated his popularity. But popularity bred suspicion among the Senate and his rivals. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, defying orders to disband his army, he set off a civil war that would bring an end to the Republic. His swift victories made him master of Rome. For a time, he ruled as dictator, initiating reforms that addressed debt, land distribution, and the calendar itself. But the fear that he aimed to crown himself king drove a group of senators to assassinate him in 44 BCE. They struck on the Ides of March, stabbing him in the Senate chamber. Instead of restoring the Republic, however, Caesar's death plunged Rome into deeper chaos. From this turmoil emerged Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, who would later be known as Augustus. At first, Octavian appeared unassuming, even frail, but his political instincts were razor-sharp. Aligning with Mark Antony and Lepidus, he formed the Second Triumvirate, a 3-man alliance that eliminated Caesar's assassins and divided power. But unity was temporary. Rivalry and ambition tore the triumvirs apart, culminating in the confrontation between Octavian and Antony. The decisive battle came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval clash off the coast of Greece. Octavian's forces defeated Antony and his ally, Cleopatra of Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra fled, eventually taking their own lives. Octavian returned to Rome as the sole ruler of the Mediterranean world. In 27 BCE, he presented himself not as a tyrant, but as the first citizen of Rome, carefully balancing appearances. The Senate granted him extraordinary powers, and though the Republic's institutions technically remained, real authority rested with him. Rome now had its first emperor. Augustus was not merely a conqueror, he was a builder and a reformer. He stabilized the economy, reformed taxation, and professionalized the army. He established a permanent standing force, the Praetorian Guard, to protect the emperor. His building program transformed the city itself. Augustus famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Temples, forums, theaters, and aqueducts rose under his reign, giving the capital a grandeur worthy of its empire. One of his greatest achievements was ushering in the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For roughly 2 centuries, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, the empire enjoyed relative stability and prosperity. Wars still occurred, but the Mediterranean basin, once a patchwork of warring states, became a unified Roman lake. Roads stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, enabling the movement of troops, goods, and ideas. Merchants carried silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, and olive oil from Spain. Rome became the hub of a vast, interconnected world. Roman culture flourished during this period. Latin literature reached new heights, with poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid crafting works that defined Western literary tradition. Virgil's Aeneid, in particular, gave Rome a mythic origin equal to Homer's epics, tying the city's destiny to the fall of Troy and the will of the gods. Architecture also advanced. The Colosseum, begun under Vespasian and completed under Titus, became the symbol of Roman engineering and public spectacle. Aqueducts carried water across valleys on arches, a testament to the empire's mastery of infrastructure. Religion evolved as well. Traditional Roman polytheism blended with local gods from across the empire. The imperial cult, which honored the emperor as semi-divine, reinforced loyalty to the state. Later, Christianity would emerge from within the empire, beginning as a small, persecuted sect, but eventually spreading across the Mediterranean and far beyond. Despite the prosperity, the imperial system had its vulnerabilities. Power was concentrated in the emperor, and succession was often uncertain. Some rulers, like Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian, were capable and far-sighted. Others, like Caligula and Nero, became notorious for cruelty, extravagance, or instability. The empire could be resilient, but a single poor leader could unleash chaos. Still, the first centuries of the empire marked Rome's high point. Its borders stretched from Britain in the northwest to the deserts of Arabia in the southeast, encompassing perhaps 60 million people. Latin and Roman law bound together diverse cultures, creating a shared identity. To be Roman was to belong to a world of roads, baths, forums, and legions. The ascent of the empire had transformed Rome from a city-state into the heart of a vast and enduring civilization. The Republic was gone, remembered nostalgically by some, but its institutions had been repurposed to support a monarchy in disguise. What remained was a system that brought peace, prosperity, and culture on a scale the ancient world had never seen. The empire had ascended, and for centuries it would dominate the stage of history. Chapter 4. Pressures from Within. At the height of the empire, Rome appeared invincible. Its legions patrolled vast frontiers, its roads stitched together continents, and its wealth dazzled the ancient world. Yet beneath the marble facades and triumphal arches, internal weaknesses were quietly corroding the stability of the Roman system. The fall of Rome was not the result of a single blow, but of many pressures building over centuries. To understand this decline, we must first look inward, at the political, economic, and social strains that weakened the empire from within. Political instability. One of Rome's most persistent problems was the question of succession. Unlike monarchies with hereditary rules, the empire lacked a consistent system for transferring power. Augustus had carefully chosen his heirs, but after his reign the process became unpredictable. Some emperors adopted capable successors, others left the throne to unprepared sons. When succession was contested, civil war often followed. The 3rd century CE became notorious for its parade of short-lived emperors, many of whom rose and fell at the whim of the army. In the space of just 50 years, from 235 to 284 CE, more than 24 emperors claimed power. Few died of natural causes. Assassination, rebellion, and coups became common, leaving Rome without continuity of leadership. This cycle of instability eroded public trust and made effective long-term governance nearly impossible. Economic troubles. Alongside political turbulence, the empire's economy began to strain. Rome's prosperity had once been fueled by conquest, as new lands and peoples poured wealth into the imperial treasury. But expansion slowed after the 2nd century CE, and the costs of maintaining the vast empire outpaced its income. The military consumed an enormous share of resources. Legions needed pay, equipment, and supplies, while frontier defenses required forts, walls, and garrisons. To meet these expenses, emperors debased the currency, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals. This caused inflation, driving up prices and undermining confidence in money. Ordinary Romans found daily life increasingly expensive, while soldiers sometimes demanded payment in land or goods rather than in unreliable coin. Trade also suffered. Pirate activity in the Mediterranean and raids along trade routes disrupted commerce. Agricultural production declined in some regions due to overworked soil, poor harvests, and neglect of infrastructure. Rome's heavy reliance on slave labor, once a source of cheap productivity, became less sustainable as conquests slowed and fewer captives entered the system. Wealth concentrated in the hands of elites who owned large estates, while small farmers fell into debt or abandonment of their land. Social and cultural shifts. The fabric of Roman society was also changing. The traditional values of discipline, duty, and civic responsibility, virtues that Romans believed had made them great, seemed to weaken as luxury and excess spread among the elite. Writers like Juvenal and Tacitus lamented the decline of morals, though their critiques often reflected nostalgia for a simpler past. Still, their complaints point to growing inequality and a sense of disconnection between the rulers and the ruled. Urban centers such as Rome itself swelled with populations dependent on grain doles and public entertainment. The Colosseum and circus races offered spectacle, but they also served as distractions from deeper problems. The gap between rich and poor widened. While senators and equestrians lived in villas adorned with mosaics and imported luxuries, countless others crowded into insula, tall, often dangerous apartment blocks prone to fires and collapse. Religion, too, began to play a divisive role. Traditional polytheism persisted, but new faiths spread throughout the empire. Eastern mystery cults, such as those of Isis and Mithras, attracted devoted followers. Christianity, once a minor sect, grew steadily despite waves of persecution. By the 3rd century, the Christian Church had become a significant social force. For many, it offered community, moral clarity, and hope amid Rome's instability. But its rise also created tension with traditional Roman institutions that had long relied on shared religious practice as a unifying force. Administrative overreach. The empire was simply enormous, stretching from the rainy hills of Britain to the deserts of Arabia. Governing such a territory placed immense strain on administration. Communication across such distances was slow, even on Rome's impressive roads. Provincial governors often acted with near independence, and corruption was widespread. Local grievances could fester for years before reaching imperial attention. To maintain order, emperors expanded bureaucracy and introduced more layers of taxation. This often created resentment. Farmers and townspeople alike shouldered heavy burdens to fund the army and bureaucracy, while tax collectors became symbols of oppression. In some provinces, overtaxation and neglect led to depopulation as families abandoned their land. The 3rd century crisis. All of these pressures converged dramatically in the 3rd century CE. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century, a period from 235 to 284 CE, when Rome nearly collapsed. Political instability saw emperors rise and fall in rapid succession. Economic troubles deepened as currency debasement and inflation accelerated. Invasions and rebellions broke out across the borders. For a time, the empire even split apart, with a Gallic empire in the west and a Palmyrene empire in the east, each ruling independently before being reconquered. Though the empire survived the crisis, largely through the efforts of emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, who restructured the state, the ordeal revealed how fragile Rome had become. The pressures within were not temporary setbacks, but symptoms of deeper structural problems. The Roman Empire in its prime had been a marvel of organization, law, and culture, but it was not immune to erosion from within. Political instability, economic strain, social inequality, and administrative overload gradually sapped its strength. While outwardly it still projected power, the empire's foundations were weakening. These internal troubles made Rome more vulnerable to the external challenges that loomed on the horizon. The empire that once seemed eternal was showing cracks. And as we turn outward to its vast frontiers, we see how pressures from beyond Rome's borders would further test its endurance. Chapter 5. Pressures from Without. Even as Rome battled corruption, instability, and economic decline within, it faced mounting pressures from beyond its frontiers. For centuries, the empire had held back waves of migrants and invaders with walls, legions, and diplomacy. Its borders stretched thousands of miles, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in Europe to the deserts of North Africa and the rivers of Mesopotamia. Yet, by the 3rd and 4th centuries ECE, those frontiers grew increasingly porous. Peoples Rome, once considered outsiders, barbarians as the Romans called them, began pressing harder against the empire's defenses. The meaning of barbarians. The word barbarus, used by Romans to describe foreigners, originally meant simply those who do not speak Greek or Latin. Over time, it carried connotations of uncivilized outsiders, but the reality was far more complex. The so-called barbarians were diverse groups: Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Huns, and many more. They were not faceless hordes, but societies with their own leaders, traditions, and ambitions. Many lived in tribes or confederations, some nomadic, others settled farmers. For centuries, Rome interacted with these groups through trade, treaties, and recruitment of mercenaries. Barbarian warriors often served in the Roman army, sometimes rising to prominent positions. The empire's borders were not absolute barriers, but zones of contact where cultures exchanged goods, ideas, and people. Still, tension often simmered. Pressure along the frontiers. The Rhine and Danube frontiers were especially vulnerable. These rivers marked the boundary between Roman provinces and Germanic tribal lands. Fortresses and garrisons lined the rivers, but no wall could hold indefinitely against growing population movements. Climatic shifts, scarcity of land, and pressure from other migrating peoples pushed tribes toward Roman territory. Raids into Roman provinces became more frequent in the 3rd century CE. Some were small-scale, aimed at plunder. Others were mass migrations, entire communities seeking new land to settle. Rome often responded with military campaigns, sometimes repelling invaders, sometimes granting them territory in exchange for peace. This pattern repeated itself over and over, slowly eroding the empire's control. The Gothic challenge. Among the most significant groups pressing against Rome were the Goths. Originally from northern Europe, the Goths migrated southward toward the Black Sea. By the 3rd century, they were raiding across the Danube into Roman lands. In 251 CE, the Goths inflicted a devastating defeat at the Battle of Abritus, where the emperor Decius was killed, the first Roman emperor to fall in battle against a foreign enemy. The relationship between Romans and Goths grew increasingly complicated. At times, the Goths fought as enemies. At other times, they were federates, allies allowed to settle inside the empire in exchange for military service. This uneasy arrangement would culminate in the 4th century with a disaster Rome could not ignore: the Huns and the domino effect. By the late 4th century, a new force appeared from the east: the Huns. Fierce nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppe, the Huns swept westward, displacing other tribes in their path. Their arrival sent shockwaves through Europe. Peoples such as the Goths, Vandals, and Alans fled westward, pressing against Rome's borders with greater desperation. The Gothic migration of 376 CE was particularly dramatic. Seeking refuge from the Huns, thousands of Goths crossed the Danube into Roman territory. The Romans initially permitted their entry, but corruption and mismanagement turned the settlement into a crisis. When officials failed to provide promised supplies, the starving Goths rebelled. 2 years later, in 378 CE, the Goths met the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople. The Emperor Valens, underestimating the Gothic forces, attacked without waiting for reinforcements. The result was catastrophic. The Roman army was annihilated, and Valens himself was killed. Adrianople marked a turning point. Rome had suffered defeats before, but never had a major field army been destroyed so completely by a migrant group. It demonstrated that the empire could no longer easily control its frontiers. The Vandals, Franks, and others. The Goths were not the only pressure on Rome. Other groups moved steadily into Roman lands. The Vandals, originally from Central Europe, migrated through Gaul and Spain before crossing into North Africa. There, they established a kingdom that would later threaten Rome's grain supply. The Franks settled in northern Gaul, gradually blending Roman and Germanic cultures. Farther north, Saxons raided along the coasts of Britain and Gaul. Each migration chipped away at Roman territory, reducing the empire's resources and manpower. Rome increasingly relied on treaties and settlements, granting land in exchange for military aid. These agreements bought time but weakened central authority as provinces slipped into the hands of semi-independent groups. Rome's response. Rome did not collapse overnight in the face of these pressures. Emperors such as Diocletian and Constantine restructured the state to cope. Diocletian reorganized the provinces, increased the size of the army, and introduced new taxation systems. Constantine strengthened the empire by founding a new capital, Constantinople, strategically placed on the Bosporus Strait. This city, fortified and wealthy, would endure long after Rome itself had fallen. Despite these efforts, the reliance on barbarian soldiers grew. Federati, or federate troops, became essential to Rome's defense. While many fought loyally, others used their position to carve out power for themselves. The Roman army was no longer purely Roman. It was a patchwork of peoples, some with loyalties divided between empire and tribe. The long strain. The external pressures did not cause Rome's collapse on their own. Rather, they compounded the empire's internal weaknesses. Political instability made coordinated responses difficult. Economic troubles limited the resources available for defense. Social tensions eroded unity. The barbarians, meanwhile, were not temporary raiders, but entire communities seeking permanent homes. Rome's old strategy of conquest and assimilation no longer worked when the empire itself was struggling to sustain its own institutions. The pressures from without transformed Rome's borders from lines of defense into frontiers of negotiation, settlement, and invasion. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, and many others were not simply outsiders battering at the gates. They were agents of change who, willingly or not, reshaped the empire. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, Rome was no longer the sole master of the Mediterranean. It was one power among many, struggling to maintain authority as the world around it shifted. The external world had pressed hard against Rome, and Rome bent under the weight. Soon the pressure would break it entirely. The sack of the Eternal City was not far away. Chapter 6. Life in a Declining Rome. The decline of Rome was not a sudden catastrophe that swept away daily life in a single stroke. For the millions of people who lived within the empire's borders, change came gradually, unevenly, and often invisibly. Families continued to raise children, merchants sold their wares, and farmers tilled their fields, even as the empire's institutions weakened. Understanding this period requires us to look closely at ordinary existence in a society that was both enduring and unraveling. The city of Rome. In the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the city of Rome remained impressive. Though its population was shrinking from the million or more it may have reached in earlier centuries. By this time, perhaps a few 100,000 people remained in the capital. The city was still filled with monumental architecture, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Circus Maximus, and countless temples and baths. Aqueducts carried water into the city, and markets bustled with vendors. Yet cracks in urban life were visible. Many of the aqueducts required costly repairs, and maintenance sometimes lapsed. The vast grain shipments from North Africa and Egypt, once the lifeline of the capital, became vulnerable to disruption. When supplies faltered, food shortages rippled through the city. The imperial government continued to distribute grain and, later, bread, but the system grew fragile. Housing revealed the inequalities of Rome. Wealthy elites still lived in spacious domus with courtyards, mosaics, and private baths, while the majority crowded into insulae, multi-story apartment blocks of wood and brick. These insulae were notorious for their instability, with collapsed floors and frequent fires. Life for the poor was precarious, especially as employment opportunities dwindled. Provincial life. Beyond the capital, life in the provinces varied widely. In some regions, such as Gaul and Spain, Roman influence had penetrated deeply. Cities retained forums, theaters, and baths, though many shrank in size. Local elites continued to model themselves on Roman senators, sponsoring buildings and games. In Britain and along the frontiers, however, Roman presence was more fragile. When troops withdrew, towns sometimes withered and villas were abandoned. Agriculture remained the backbone of the empire. Large estates, often owned by absentee landlords, dominated production. Tenant farmers worked the land in exchange for protection and a share of crops. Small independent farms still existed, but were increasingly rare. Over time, many peasants became tied to the land, a system that foreshadowed medieval serfdom. Economy and trade. The Roman economy during the decline was troubled but not collapsed. Trade networks still carried goods across the Mediterranean: grain, olive oil, wine, pottery, and textiles. Amphorae stamped with makers' marks show how far goods traveled. However, piracy, invasions, and declining state control made long-distance trade riskier. Local production grew more important, and some regions became more self-sufficient. Inflation and currency debasement continued to erode financial stability. Coins of earlier centuries contained high silver content, but by the later empire, many were little more than bronze tokens. To cope, local economies often reverted to barter or payments in kind. Taxes were increasingly collected, not in coin, but in produce, livestock, or labor. Religion and community. Religion played a central role in daily life. By the 4th century, Christianity had moved from persecuted sect to official faith of the empire. Constantine's conversion in the early 300s, and Theodosius's declaration of Christianity as the state religion in 380 CE transformed public life. Pagan temples declined in importance, while churches rose in towns and cities. Bishops became influential community leaders, often wielding more authority than imperial officials. For many ordinary people, Christianity provided stability and meaning amid uncertainty. Churches offered charity to the poor, rituals to mark life's passages, and a sense of belonging that transcended local identities. At the same time, traditional pagan practices did not vanish overnight. Old rituals lingered in rural areas, and many people lived in a blended religious landscape. Entertainment and culture. Public entertainment continued, though on a reduced scale. Gladiatorial games, once the height of Roman spectacle, became less common by the 5th century, discouraged by Christian leaders who condemned their brutality. Chariot races in the Circus Maximus, however, remained popular, with fans fiercely loyal to their favorite teams. Theater performances, storytelling, and festivals continued to provide distraction from hardship. Literacy was uneven but persisted among elites. Scribes copied classical texts, preserving works of philosophy, science, and literature that would later influence the medieval and modern worlds. Education remained a marker of status, and knowledge of Latin rhetoric was still prized. In the Eastern Empire, Greek continued to dominate intellectual life. The military in society. For many families, military service was both opportunity and burden. The army remained one of the few avenues for upward mobility, especially for provincials and non-Romans. Service brought pay, land grants, and the possibility of citizenship for descendants. But the demands of constant recruitment strained communities, especially as conscription expanded to meet external threats. The growing reliance on Federate troops, non-Roman soldiers allied with the empire, changed the character of the military. In some regions, local populations saw little distinction between Roman forces and the barbarian federates stationed nearby. This blending blurred the lines of identity, further signaling the transformation of Rome from a singular culture into a more fragmented world, a world holding on. Despite the strains, life in the declining empire was not unrelentingly bleak. Farmers still harvested crops, artisans crafted pottery, children played in courtyards, and markets echoed with bargaining. Local leaders, both secular and religious, kept communities functioning even as imperial authority weakened. In some provinces, the decline was hardly noticeable at first. In others, particularly along vulnerable frontiers, change came swiftly. What united these experiences was the sense that the old guarantees of Roman order, the security of the legions, the stability of currency, the abundance of trade, could no longer be taken for granted. People adapted, as people always do, finding ways to survive and thrive, even as the structures around them shifted. Life in a declining Rome was a paradox. On the surface, much continued as it always had. Bread was baked, sermons preached, races run, contracts signed. Yet beneath the surface, the signs of erosion were clear. Crumbling infrastructure, weakened authority, faltering trade, and shifting identities. For those who lived through it, the fall of Rome was not a single event, but a slow transformation of their world. The empire still existed, but it was no longer the same empire it had once been, and soon even the Eternal City itself would face shocks that no citizen could ignore. Chapter 7. Division of the Empire. By the late 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was staggering under the weight of its size and its problems. Internal strife, economic disruption, military defeats, and invasions had nearly torn the empire apart during the crisis of the 3rd century. The restoration of stability required strong rulers and bold reforms. Out of this crucible came a transformation that would change Rome forever. The formal division of the empire into eastern and western halves, Diocletian and the Tetrarchy. The first major step toward division came under the Emperor Diocletian, who took power in 284 CE. Diocletian was a soldier of humble origins, but he proved to be a capable and pragmatic reformer. Confronted with the impossibility of one man governing an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, he created a new system of rule, the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. Under this arrangement, the empire was divided into two parts, east and west. Each half was governed by an Augustus, senior emperor, and assisted by a Caesar, junior emperor. The idea was to share power, improve administration, and ensure smooth succession. The east, with its wealthier provinces, was ruled from Nicomedia in Asia Minor, while the west was governed from Mediolanum, modern Milan, and later Trier. Diocletian also introduced sweeping reforms. He reorganized provincial administration, expanded the bureaucracy, and imposed new tax systems. Recognizing the importance of the military, he increased the size of the army and fortified frontiers. Though his policies were harsh, tax burdens were heavy, and he enforced a rigid social order tying people to their professions, they brought stability after decades of crisis. Constantine and the New Rome. The Tetrarchy collapsed after Diocletian's abdication in 305 CE. Rivalries among emperors led to renewed civil war. Out of this chaos emerged Constantine the Great, who became sole ruler after defeating his rivals by 324 CE. Constantine reshaped the empire in ways that would resonate for centuries. One of his most significant acts was the founding of a new capital in the East. In 330 CE, he dedicated Constantinople, the city of Constantine, on the site of the ancient city of Byzantium. Strategically located on the Bosporus Strait, it commanded key trade routes between Europe and Asia and was easily defensible, surrounded by water on three sides. Constantinople quickly grew into a thriving metropolis, rich with palaces, churches, forums, and hippodromes. Constantine also played a pivotal role in the empire's religious transformation. His conversion to Christianity and the Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted tolerance to Christians, ending centuries of persecution. Over time, Christianity became increasingly tied to imperial identity, culminating in its adoption as the official state religion under Theodosius I, later in the century. This shift further distinguished the empire from its pagan past and reshaped cultural life. East and West, unequal halves. The division of the empire was not merely administrative convenience, it reflected deeper realities. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, was wealthier, more urbanized, and more resilient. It controlled rich provinces such as Egypt, which supplied abundant grain, and regions of Asia Minor and Syria, which were hubs of trade and industry. The East's cities were vibrant centers of commerce and culture, with strong fortifications and enduring institutions. The Western Empire, by contrast, faced greater challenges. Its economy was more agrarian, with less access to the wealth of the East. Provinces such as Gaul, Britain, and Spain were vulnerable to raids and invasions. Rome itself remained a symbolic capital, but emperors often ruled from other cities closer to the frontiers, such as Ravenna. The West struggled to maintain the same level of resources, stability, and defense as the East. Administrative consequences. The division also altered the structure of governance. Provincial territories were subdivided into smaller units to make them easier to administer. The empire was organized into dioceses, each overseen by officials answerable to the emperor. This bureaucracy grew larger and more complex, absorbing resources but also ensuring tighter control. In the military, emperors increasingly relied on mobile field armies rather than static frontier garrisons. This allowed quicker responses to invasions, but also left some regions exposed. The integration of barbarian federates into the army became more pronounced, further blurring the line between Roman and foreign. The West in decline. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the differences between East and West became stark. The Eastern Empire, fortified by Constantinople and bolstered by wealth, managed to repel or absorb invasions. It maintained strong trade networks and a functioning tax system. The West, however, was battered by migrations and invasions it could not contain. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE was a shocking symbol of the West's vulnerability. Although Rome recovered somewhat, its prestige was permanently diminished. Meanwhile, the East weathered storms more successfully, preserving stability and continuing to flourish. This imbalance would eventually lead to the permanent separation of the two empires, a tale of two Romes. By the end of the 4th century, the division of the empire was effectively permanent. Though the idea of unity lingered, the political, economic, and cultural realities pointed toward two distinct paths. The Eastern Empire, increasingly known as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West. Its cities, scholars, and armies would preserve Roman traditions long after the old capital had crumbled. The Western Empire, however, faced mounting pressures it could no longer withstand. As the 5th century progressed, it slipped steadily toward collapse. The division of the empire had been intended to save Rome by sharing the burden of governance, but it also sealed the fate of the West by making plain its relative weakness. The division of the Roman Empire was both a practical solution and a turning point in history. Diocletian and Constantine had sought to preserve the empire through reform, and in the East their efforts succeeded. Constantinople would become a beacon of Roman legacy, wealth, and culture for centuries. But in the West, the same pressures that had plagued the empire for generations only intensified. The empire was no longer a single, unified power stretching across the known world. It had become two Romes, destined for two very different futures. And in the West, the shadows of collapse were lengthening. Chapter 8. The Sack of Rome. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the known world. It was the eternal city, the seat of emperors, the heart of empire. Even as power shifted to Constantinople and emperors ruled from distant cities, Rome remained the symbolic capital of civilization. Its walls had not been breached by a foreign enemy in nearly 800 years. To Romans and their subjects, the city seemed untouchable, protected by history, tradition, and the sheer weight of its legacy. That illusion came to an end in 410 CE, when the Visigoths under their king Alaric marched through the gates and plundered the Eternal City. The rise of Alaric. Alaric was a leader of the Visigoths, one of the Germanic peoples who had long pressed against Rome's borders. Like many barbarians, the Goths had a complicated relationship with the empire. They fought against Rome at times, but they also fought for Rome, serving as soldiers and federates. Alaric himself had once commanded Gothic troops in the Roman army. He admired Rome's power, but he also resented the empire's treatment of his people. By the early 5th century, the Western Empire was in crisis. The government was weak, finances strained, and rival generals fought for power. Honorius, the emperor at the time, ruled not from Rome but from Ravenna, a city protected by marshes and easier to defend. This left the old capital politically sidelined, even as it retained immense symbolic importance. Negotiations and siege. Alaric and his Goths entered Italy in 401 CE, threatening Rome itself. Over the next several years, he besieged the city multiple times. His demands were not initially for destruction, but for recognition, land, and payment. He wanted his people to be granted secure territory within the empire where they could live and farm under Roman protection. But negotiations repeatedly broke down, as Roman officials delayed, deceived, or refused his terms. The first siege in 408 CE caused widespread fear. Famine and disease spread as supplies dwindled. The Senate negotiated a ransom to persuade Alaric to withdraw, vast sums of gold, silver, and silk, along with thousands of pounds of pepper. Rome survived, but the message was clear. The Eternal City was vulnerable. The breach of 410 CE. 2 years later, in August 410 CE, Alaric returned. Accounts differ on how the city was breached. Some sources suggest that slaves opened the gates from within, tired of the suffering of siege. Others describe treachery or a negotiated entry gone wrong. Whatever the exact cause, the Visigoths entered Rome on August 24th. For 3 days, the city endured plunder. Houses were looted, treasures seized, and the population terrorized. Temples, once the pride of Roman religion, were stripped of valuables. Yet the sack was not one of indiscriminate slaughter. Christian churches, such as the Basilica of St. Peter, were reportedly respected as places of sanctuary. The destruction was real and traumatic, but it was not the wholesale annihilation some feared. Still, the psychological impact was immense. For the first time in centuries, Rome itself had fallen to an enemy. The city that had conquered the Mediterranean now lay humbled before outsiders, it once dismissed as barbarians. The world reacts. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves throughout the empire and beyond. Pagans and Christians alike searched for meaning in the disaster. Pagan writers argued that Rome's abandonment of the old gods in favor of Christianity had angered the divine and doomed the city. Christian thinkers, such as Augustine of Hippo, countered with new interpretations. Augustine began his monumental work, The City of God, in response to the sack, arguing that no earthly city, even Rome, was eternal. Only the heavenly city of God truly endured. For contemporaries, the sack marked a profound rupture. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The sense of invincibility that had surrounded Rome for centuries was gone. Aftermath and consequences. Alaric did not intend to destroy Rome. After 3 days, his forces withdrew, moving south in search of food and new lands. Not long afterward, Alaric himself died, and the Visigoths eventually settled in Gaul and Spain. Rome, though battered, remained physically intact and would recover in the short term. But its aura of eternal dominance was broken. The sack also highlighted the impotence of the Western imperial government. Honorius remained safe in Ravenna, but his inability to defend the capital revealed the weakness of the empire's leadership. The Western Empire still existed, but it was increasingly hollow, relying on negotiation with, or appeasement of, outside groups rather than commanding them with overwhelming force. A symbolic turning point. The sack of 410 did not end the Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire thrived, and the western half endured for another 6 decades. Yet the event became a symbol of Rome's decline. For the people of the time, it was a shocking reminder that even the mightiest institutions could fall. For historians, it marked the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. Rome, once master of the world, had been humbled by a migrating people seeking survival. The eternal city was no longer eternal in the way its citizens had believed. Though life would go on and the city itself would recover, the sack of Rome revealed to all that the empire's foundations were crumbling. Chapter 9. The Last Emperor. The sack of Rome in 410 C had shattered the illusion of invincibility, but the Western Roman Empire staggered on for another 66 years. It survived more invasions, civil wars, and the carving away of its provinces by outsiders who once feared its might. Yet by the mid-5th century, the empire in the West was a shadow of what it had been. Its armies relied heavily on barbarian federates, its finances were depleted, and its emperors were increasingly powerless figures manipulated by generals. The final act of the Western Empire would play out in 476 CE, with the deposition of a boy who bore the most resonant name of all, Romulus, a hollow throne. By the 470s, the Western Empire had lost most of its territories. Britain, Gaul, and Spain had slipped into the control of local rulers or invading peoples. North Africa, once the granary of Rome, had been seized by the Vandals, whose fleets menaced the Mediterranean. Italy itself remained under imperial control, but barely. Ravenna, a city protected by swamps and waterways, had become the seat of government. safer than Rome, but symbolic of how far the empire had retreated. The emperors of this period were figureheads. Real power lay with military strongmen, particularly those of barbarian origin. These generals commanded the loyalty of troops, who were themselves often Germanic or other non-Roman recruits. The empire's reliance on such forces reflected both its weakness and the blurred line between Roman and barbarian in the late empire, Romulus Augustulus. In 475 CE, a man named Orestes seized control of the government. Orestes had been a secretary to Attila the Hun earlier in his career, but later rose within Roman service. After forcing the emperor Julius Nepos to flee, Orestes installed his teenage son on the throne. The boy's name was Romulus, but his youth and inexperience led later writers to call him Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. The choice of name was deeply ironic. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus was the empire's first emperor. The boy who bore both names became the last ruler of the West. He did not govern in any real sense. His father, Orestes, made decisions and wielded power, using his son as a puppet to give his regime legitimacy. The rise of Odoacer. Among the Federate soldiers in Italy was a Germanic leader named Odoacer. He commanded troops who had long fought for Rome, but who now demanded a greater share of land and rewards. When Orestes refused their demands, the Federates rebelled under Odoacer's leadership. In 476 CE, Odoacer's forces captured and executed Orestes. They then turned to Ravenna, where Romulus Augustulus resided. The boy emperor was deposed without bloodshed. Odoacer, recognizing the child's youth and harmlessness, spared his life. Romulus was sent into comfortable exile, perhaps in Campania, where he disappears from the historical record. The end of the Western Empire. After deposing Romulus, Odoacer did something unprecedented. Rather than appointing a new Western emperor, he sent the imperial regalia, the diadem and purple robes, to Constantinople. He informed the Eastern Emperor, Zeno, that the West no longer needed its own emperor and that he would govern Italy as Zeno's representative. In practice, Odoacer ruled Italy independently, but his gesture symbolized the end of the Western Roman Empire as a distinct political entity. For contemporaries, it was not necessarily seen as the dramatic fall of Rome described by later historians. To them, it was one more stage in a long process of decline and transformation. But for posterity, 476 CE became the traditional date of the empire's end, symbolism and legacy. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus carried immense symbolic weight. The empire that began with Augustus in 27 BCE ended with Augustulus. The city founded, according to legend, by Romulus, ended its western imperial line with another Romulus. History had come full circle, though in tragic fashion. Yet Rome itself did not vanish. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 more years, centered on Constantinople. Roman law, culture, and traditions endured in both East and West. The papacy in Rome grew in influence, preserving Latin learning and Christian authority. The kingdoms that arose in the former western provinces, Visigothic Spain, Vandal North Africa, Frankish Gaul, and later the Ostrogothic and Lombard realms in Italy, all drew on Roman institutions and saw themselves, in some sense, as heirs of Rome. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was less an apocalyptic collapse than a transformation. In 476 CE, a boy emperor was quietly removed from power, and a new Germanic king took his place. The empire that had once ruled the known world was gone in the West, but its memory, culture, and institutions persisted, shaping Europe for centuries. The story of Romulus Augustulus and Odoacer marks both an ending and a beginning. the end of ancient Rome as a political power in the West, and the beginning of the medieval world that would rise upon its ruins. Chapter 10. Rome's Legacy. When Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476 CE, contemporaries may not have fully grasped that they were witnessing the end of an era. To many, life went on much as before. Fields were sown, markets held, sermons preached, and armies marched under new banners. Yet, historians have long marked that moment as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. If Rome's political dominance in the West ended, its cultural, legal, and spiritual legacy did not. Instead, Rome lived on, woven into the very fabric of medieval and modern civilization. The Byzantine continuation. The most direct legacy of Rome was the survival of the Eastern Empire. What we call the Byzantine Empire was, to its inhabitants, simply the Roman Empire. Its emperors styled themselves as Roman. Its capital at Constantinople was the New Rome, and its laws and institutions remained recognizably Roman. For nearly 1,000 years after 476, the Eastern Empire preserved and adapted Roman traditions. Under Justinian in the 6th century, Roman law was codified into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, which became one of the most influential legal collections in history. Byzantine scholars copied and preserved classical texts, ensuring that Greek and Roman literature, philosophy, and science would survive to inspire later generations. The Latin West. In the West, the fall of imperial authority did not erase Rome's imprint. Successor kingdoms built by Goths, Vandals, and Franks all borrowed heavily from Roman administration. Kings issued laws in Latin, minted coins with Roman symbols, and adopted Roman titles. The idea of Rome as the standard of civilization endured even as political power shifted. The Catholic Church became a primary carrier of Roman tradition. Based in Rome itself, the papacy preserved Latin as the language of scholarship and liturgy. Monasteries became centers of learning, where classical texts were copied alongside Christian works. The Church's hierarchical structure echoed Roman bureaucracy, while its universal aspirations mirrored the empire's. Law and governance. Roman law left an especially enduring mark. Concepts of property rights, contracts, citizenship, and legal precedent shaped the governance of medieval Europe and, centuries later, influenced modern systems of civil law. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, the prestige of Roman legal tradition gave rulers legitimacy and a foundation for authority. The Roman idea of citizenship also endured, even if in altered forms. Though no longer tied to a single empire, the concept that law could define membership in a broader community influenced both medieval political thought and modern notions of nationhood and rights. Language and culture. Perhaps Rome's most visible legacy was linguistic. Latin did not vanish with the empire. It evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Even in regions where Latin was not the vernacular, it remained the language of the church, of scholarship, and of law for more than a millennium. To speak Latin was to connect oneself to Rome. Roman architecture, engineering, and urban planning also left their mark. Roads built by Roman engineers continued to guide travelers and armies. Bridges, aqueducts, and amphitheaters remained visible reminders of Rome's skill, many still standing centuries after the empire's fall. Later builders imitated Roman forms in cathedrals, castles, and eventually Renaissance palaces. Religion and identity. Rome's embrace of Christianity ensured that its greatest spiritual legacy outlasted its political one. By the time the Western Empire fell, Christianity was firmly established as the dominant religion of Europe. The fusion of Roman statecraft with Christian faith shaped medieval Christendom. The Bishop of Rome, or Pope, became a spiritual heir to the emperors, while emperors of the East saw themselves as guardians of the faith. The idea of Rome as an eternal model also survived in political imagination. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 CE, styled his realm as a revival of the Roman Empire, a mantle later claimed by the Holy Roman Empire. Centuries after the fall, rulers continued to invoke Rome to justify their authority. The Western imagination. Beyond institutions, Rome left a powerful place in the imagination. Writers, artists, and thinkers throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance looked back to Rome as both inspiration and warning. The grandeur of the empire and the tragedy of its fall became symbols used to explain the rise and fall of kingdoms, the dangers of corruption, and the fragility of power. Renaissance humanists studied Latin texts to recover what they saw as the lost wisdom of antiquity, sparking a cultural rebirth rooted in Rome's legacy. Even today, the language of Rome endures in politics and culture. Senates, republics, and constitutions borrow Roman terms. Architectural styles evoke Roman columns and arches. Legal systems echo Roman principles. And in countless stories and histories, the rise and fall of Rome serves as a touchstone for reflecting on power, ambition, and decline. The Eternal Rome. The Western Roman Empire ended in 476 CE with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. But Rome itself never truly died. Its empire transformed into kingdoms, its institutions into the church and medieval states, its language into new tongues, and its memory into a guiding narrative for civilizations to come. Rome was both a city and an idea. The city endured, battered but never erased, and still stands today on the banks of the Tiber. The idea endured even more strongly, shaping law, language, religion, and imagination across continents and centuries. In this sense, the title, Eternal City, was not misplaced. Rome as an empire may have fallen, but Rome as a legacy lives on. A reminder that history's endings are also beginnings, and that the echoes of a civilization can last far longer than its walls.